So hello everybody, welcome to our Friday colloquium. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Oscar Venter stepping in on short notice to present for Dr. Dave Connell, who had to travel unexpectedly out of town for a family situation. So I'm really grateful for Oscar for stepping in. We're still on next week's presentation will be Chief Roland Wilson of the West Moberly First Nations, talking about the Williston Reservoir and the impacts on his community of that reservoir. I can see the notice for further details on what exactly he's going to talk about. And let's see here. And then I'm still looking for master's presentations for our Canadian Institute of Forestry Masters Night. The deadline was today, but well, it's 3:30, so that's till midnight, so that's what, 7.5 hours? So lots of time to get an abstract in. So on with today's colloquium presentation. So Oscar completed his undergrad degree in environmental science at Concordia University in Montreal before heading to Australia for a PhD in forest conservation at the University of Queensland, which he completed in 2011. After his PhD, he felt he hadn't had quite enough of Australia's beaches and no worries philosophy, so he decided to linger down under for two postdocs. Then everything changed with the birth of his son Forrest earlier this year. Oscar and his wife Michelle decided that they had to flee from the land of convicts and get back home to Canada. Luckily, UNBC opened its doors and gave Oscar a chair to sit in. That's the West Fraser FRBC Growth and Yield Chair in ESM. Oscar's research aims to improve our understanding of the trade-offs and synergies among economic production, ecosystem services, and conservation, primarily in forested ecosystems. Much of his work has been at regional scales in Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia, looking at forest planning and payments for forest carbon storage. But today he's going to be talking about some of the work he's been doing focused around human pressures and conservation policy at the global scale.
Thanks for the introduction, Al. Thank you all for coming too. This is great attendance. We've only been here for about 2 weeks, so I really don't have any social capital to strong arm anyone into coming. So I know you're all here because you really want to be here. Unless, are people mandated to be here for the 7-0? Unless you're mandated to be here. Yeah, so we're coming up from Australia. It's been a big change. We've been here for 2 weeks. We were living in tropical Australia, where, just to put a number to the difference, in our coldest month, our most frigid month, February, the average daily high gets down to a frigid 26 degrees. So it's been about 8 years since I've seen snow, but it's been very beautiful. Really been enjoying the time in Prince George, enjoying relearning how to walk on snow and drive on snow, how to be strategic and how to plow the, in plowing the driveway. I've also really been enjoying meeting everybody here, in the hallways and over coffee, which is really why I took the opportunity to give this seminar. I think it's a great opportunity for me to introduce myself to you all and just to give you a bit of a glimpse into the sort of research that I do. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about mapping human pressures and conservation globally. So we're talking really broad scale here, and we're just thinking really big picture. I wanted to start by just giving a bit of kind of background information to convince you why we should care about human pressures and conservation and why we should care about it at the global scale. So don't worry about the details of any of these graphs. That doesn't matter. Why I'm showing you them is to illustrate that there's little doubt that we're now entering a new epoch, dubbed the Anthropocene, which is defined by human activities altering natural systems on geological scales. So these red graphs, those are 12 major socioeconomic trends over the last 200 years. And what they're showing is a rapid acceleration since about 1950 in the size of our societies and the size of our economies and the size of the things that we build. Coincident with that, we have 12 major trends in ecological systems which show at the same time a rapid increase in the sorts of pressures that we put on natural systems. So this is things like our carbon pollution, our conversion of natural habitats, and our erosion of the biosphere, which is the living parts of the planet. So clearly we're entering a new epoch characterized by large-scale change occurring across the globe because of human activities. What's not exactly clear is whether we're perturbing natural systems into places or at levels which are unsafe and likely to lead potentially to rapid changes that could undermine our societies and undermine our economies. So this is a figure, you're probably all familiar with this figure. It comes from the Stockholm Resilient Institute. This is an update they did to the original figure. They published this, I think, last year. This is just showing for a range of environmental issues like ocean acidification and chemical pollution and erosion of the biosphere, which I'm particularly interested in, whether they think, based on the state of our knowledge, we're in a safe territory. So those are issues which are shown in green, like fresh water use. We're into uncertain territories, like land use change, shown in yellow, or whether we're into unsafe territory, where we're likely to see large changes that compromise our societies and our economies. And those are issues on red. So you see for the biosphere, the erosion of the biosphere, they think it's very clear we're into unsafe territory. We're losing genetic diversity and species diversity at a rate that's about 1,000 times above background normal rates. And with this loss of genetic diversity goes the functional diversity that keeps ecosystems functioning in ways to provide the services that we depend on. Now, the erosion of the biosphere is fairly significant, partly because once it's gone, it's basically gone. There's nothing we can do to really rebuild the biosphere. We'd have to wait millions of years for speciation to recreate the sort of diversity that we see around us. So while we don't really know the impacts of the erosion of the biosphere, we know that those impacts may be essentially irreversible, which I think is a strong reason to conduct science and provide information that can help us better manage our interactions with natural systems to avoid the worst outcomes, the worst potential outcomes. So this is just kind of a rough model of my thinking of the sort of science that we as natural scientists can conduct to help inform the better management of the biosphere. So I think you can do things like try and better understand how natural systems operate, through ecological analyses, ecological science. This is an area I don't do a lot of work. But I do a lot of work across these latter four boxes, which include things like, understanding how we're changing natural systems, understanding how we can use traditional conservation responses like protected areas to mitigate some of that change, and also how we can start to think more innovatively and use things like economics to value ecosystem services and use decision science to really explore the trade-offs between economic development and the stability of natural systems. So I do a lot of work in that latter sphere, kind of at regional and landscape scales, primarily in Southeast Asia. I'm looking forward to initiating some projects in British Columbia and in Canada, exploring this sort of trade-off analysis and ecosystem services. But today I'm going to talk about those boxes in white. This is broad-scale work to map human pressures and to look at conservation responses in particular protected areas. Okay, so if we want to better manage the biosphere, really the jumping off point is to try and understand where humans have altered natural systems and how they've altered those natural systems. We want to know where places are degraded and where places are still largely in a natural state. And I say largely in a natural state because really, humans have altered everywhere on the planet, some more than others. So for this project, the objective was basically to map human pressures or human change in natural systems globally. So how do we map pressures? One of the most common approaches is to use satellite-derived information and remote sensing to map. Sorry, it's my son Forrest. He doesn't know when he should cry and when he should be quiet. Though he is rather cooperative. So remote sensing is a very powerful set of tools because we can map kind of land cover across very broad areas, and we can do repeated measurements so we can look at change through time. With advances or developments in the power of our computers, remote sensing has become much more powerful. This is a data product which has mapped forest cover and forest cover change for the entire globe, but at the 30-meter resolution. So pixels are about the size of a suburban block. And the percent tree cover of those suburban block size parcels across the entire world have been mapped in a single data product. And this was done through collaboration with Google, so it was actually run on Google's supercomputers. So really cool stuff coming out of remote sensing to understand how we're changing natural systems. You know, so in red, those are areas where we're cutting down forests. It's hard to see, it doesn't really matter. But remote sensing does have shortcomings. I'm just going to show you a couple of them. This is a pastoral landscape in Botswana. You can see small human settlement there, and you can see cattle lines through the landscape because these are pastoralists. So remote sensing, basically most remote sensing techniques would not notice that there are humans in this landscape and that they're doing things. It would just classify this as being an arid ecotype. But clearly there are humans there and they're all altering the system, though at a fairly low level. So remote sensing in arid environments doesn't always perform very well, and for kind of low intensity human pressures, it doesn't always perform very well. This is another example. This is a forested landscape from Borneo in Indonesia. And this is showing a selective logging landscape. You can see a logging road and small-scale patches of forest clearance. Again, this is not a very intense pressure. This is kind of a low-impact pressure. But it does give access to people, access to this forest wilderness to people, and you do get things like increased hunting of primates like the orangutan. So this is a low-impact pressure. Again, most remote sensing techniques, unless it was techniques like LiDAR, but most would basically not notice that there's humans in this landscape. Remote sensing is a very powerful technique, but it does have some limitations, and that's where what I call cumulative threat mapping, for lack of a better term, comes in. The cumulative threat mapping aims to combine both top-down remotely sensed data with data which is collected bottom-up, either through surveys, like population censuses, or through modeling approaches. So it's to combine top-down and bottom-up data on human pressures to the environment to get an overall picture of how we're altering natural systems. The most widely known cumulative pressure map is the human footprint map, which I'm showing you here. This is developed by Eric Sanderson and the Wildlife Conservation Society in the Bronx, New York. It's a really excellent data set. It's still being used and cited about 100 times each year. But the data is really quite old now. It's based primarily on data from about 1990, so it's basically 25 years old. So it's providing quite a dated view of the planet, particularly given the rapid changes we've seen over the last 60 years. So the aim of this study was for us to create a more recent update of the human footprint map so we can get a more contemporary understanding of human pressures, and also to go back and create a comparable product from the early 1990s so we could look at change through time. We couldn't use the original footprint because it was methods we couldn't replicate exactly. So what we did is we got 8 spatially explicit data sets which kind of broadly covered the way humans change natural systems, or provided proxies for those ways. So these are 8 human pressures. Some of them were remotely sensed, and some of them were created bottom up. So like human population density, that's surveyed data. Navigable waterways, this is a data set we created. It wasn't available, so we modeled where people are likely to be taking boats up rivers all over the world, because that's a major form of access into a lot of wilderness areas, bringing people in and products out. So we gathered or created these eight data sets on human pressure, and then because they're in very different units, humans per square kilometer, or croplands, that's binary data basically. What we needed to do is get them onto a comparable scale so we could put them all together. So what we did is we basically kind of created a weight for each data layer, which is a rough approximation of how important or the potential for that pressure to alter natural systems. So you can see urban areas are a more powerful pressure than pasture lands. But to be honest, it's fairly hand-wavy, this part of it. But basically, we put them on a comparable scale, and then we add all the pressures together to come up with an overall map of human pressures to the environment, and that's what we get here. So this is the new map of the global human footprint. It's currently in review, but once the paper gets accepted, we're going to make this data available to everybody right away, so it could start to be used in the sorts of studies the old footprint is currently being used in. So that's what you can see is human pressures are fairly spatially variable across the planet. The pattern that we see at this sort of scale seems to make sense. You know, India, parts of China, very heavily impacted. Western Europe, Eastern US as well. And then a lot of places don't have a lot of pressures, you know, particularly the Arctic and the desert areas. But that's a very broad scale view of the planet, right? So can we trust this data once we start to zoom into finer scales? Because a lot of people are going to want to use this information to look at, you know, distribution of pressures across, you know, maybe BC or a finer resolution than that. So one way to ask that question is what we normally do is we zoom into a place that we know well. So let's do that. We're going to zoom into Salt Spring Island, where I went to high school. Does anybody kind of know or been to Salt Spring Island? Okay, so you guys can verify whether I'm being truthful here or just, you know, lying. So this is Salt Spring Island, just off Vancouver Island. That's it there. That's showing the human footprint for Salt Spring Island. So what we've done is we've taken a map that's got 140 million pixels, 1 kilometer pixels, and we've zoomed into about 100 of those pixels. And I'm asking, does the distribution of pressures across those 100 pixels make sense based on my knowledge of Salt Spring Island? Those that know Salt Spring, would you say it does? Roughly. So this is the main residential corridor between Crofton and the main town, Ganges. This is secondary residential corridor coming down to Fulford Harbour. That's Ruckle Park. That's Mount Bruce and Mount Tuam, and that's Mount Maxwell. So it's not doing a bad job of mapping Salt Spring. We'll compare that to the best remotely sensed product we currently have. It's from the European Space Agency, Glob Cover. It's mapping the whole area as natural. It's not picking up the kind of low density residential or agricultural lands on Salt Spring. So the human footprint's doing fairly well in this one instance, right? But that's not very scientific, right? We need a bigger sample. So what we did is we got some students involved that wanted to be involved with research, and we worked with them to create a key which they could use to visually interpret human pressures that they could see in the landscape using Google Earth. Now, the images on Google Earth, the ones that we looked at, were on average 0.5 meter resolution. So you can really see that we're not talking Landsat 30-meter data, which is really good for land cover mapping. We're talking 0.5 meter resolution, so you can really see what's going on in the landscape. So we randomly created 3,000 1-kilometer sample points, and the students went with the visual key, looked at images like this, and scored the pressures that they could see in those 1-kilometer plots. And then we could compare that visual validation to our map of the human footprint, which we get here. So those are the plots. Darker is heavier impacts. You can see basically the same sort of pattern. And if we compare them in a pairwise pixel to pixel, about 96% of the time, visually interpreted scores are within 20%, and we call that a hit. Within 20% of the score as mapped by the human footprint. So basically, I think the human footprint's a pretty good map of the current distribution of human pressures to the environment. And there's a few maps of human pressures out there as cumulative threat maps. This is the first real attempt to try and validate the quality of the data. And we did it because we were just getting some really negative reviews, going, how can we trust any of this data? You're just throwing all sorts of stuff at it. So it's back in review now, and hopefully people will appreciate the validation. So the basic idea was to create a data set for other people to use, but we thought we would just take the opportunity to explore what the data is telling us. So this is one exploration. This is focusing on biodiversity hotspots. Most people probably know what biodiversity hotspots are. They're the places in the planet with lots of species and also very high rates of habitat loss. Remotely sensing tells us that about 15% of biodiversity hotspots are still natural, and those are meant to be priorities for conservation. Lots of species, there's still about 15% of them natural. When we use the human footprint to look at biodiversity hotspots, we find actually only 3% of their area are still natural. So human pressures are much more extensive in biodiversity hotspots than we previously thought, using remote sensing data. We also looked at change through time in the footprint over the last 2 decades. You can see there's a lot of change, particularly in developing countries and the tropics. There's a lot of expansion of the human footprint and intensification of the footprint. But there's also a lot of places which are getting better. The footprint's shrinking. We kind of did some exploration. Can we explain why we get these sort of differences across the planet? I'm not really going to go into it, but basically, following environmental Kuznets curve theory, it's really lower middle income countries. This is countries with enough capital to, let's say, buy bulldozers and really get access to the natural resources. These are the places where you're having large increases in the human footprint. Really wealthy nations, which in theory should be able to have the capital resources to better manage their environmental impacts. Indeed, we see that really there's not that much increase in the human footprint. And if we look at the wealthiest 30 countries, that's them there. There's actually a contraction of the footprint, so they're actually seeing improvements. And that's probably largely due to urbanization, people moving out of more remote places. So that's kind of the first phase of that project. It's wrapped up now. There's a lot of spin-off projects. So James Watson is a colleague. He's leading an analysis to look at wilderness decline globally. Where are the last tracts of wilderness across the globe? And which ones have succumbed to change over the last 2 decades, because we can look at this change. I also just got a grant to further explore these ideas in the lower Mekong countries in Southeast Asia, but also in Canada. So in the next couple weeks, I'm going to be advertising for a postdoc to work on this project for a couple of years. And I'm looking forward to kind of discussing with people here where would be good places to explore this cumulative threat mapping. And there's some concepts that we'd like to explore. Where would be some good places in Canada to do that? Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now. We're not going to talk about human pressures anymore. We're now going to start talking about protected areas. Now, protected areas are the primary means that we have to separate the biosphere or biodiversity from the sorts of human pressures I was just mapping. This map shows all the world's marine and terrestrial protected areas. You can see there's quite a few of them out there. This graph down here shows their growth over the last 130 years. And you can see basically protected areas as a land use have been expanding rapidly since about 1960, which is pretty interesting, right? So we're seeing a rapid acceleration of conservation effort, which is coincident with that rapid acceleration of human pressures that I showed you earlier. Protected areas now cover more land area than all the world's crops combined. So they really are an important land use when you're thinking about the global scale. Protected area expansion is promoted by international policy under the Convention on Biodiversity. This is a really important international convention where countries have agreed. Most recently in 2010, 193 countries, including Canada, agreed to expand protected areas to cover 17% of the planet by 2020. If they achieve this, and it looks like they're going to achieve it, it's going to be the biggest expansion in protected areas in history. Be about 600 million hectares of new parks. And now, as protected areas are meant to be the primary means we have for safeguarding biodiversity or the biosphere, there's a lot of hope that this expansion of protected areas that's ongoing right now and is going to continue until 2020 is going to be a major push for biodiversity conservation. That's particularly possible because countries have also agreed, aspirationally really, to prevent the extinction of all known threatened species. They're probably hoping that this protected area expansion is going to contribute to this biodiversity conservation. Now, because of this policy and this rapid expansion of parks, there's a lot of interest at the moment to kind of build scenarios that explore what is achieving that 17% protection going to do for biodiversity conservation. There's been a lot of work basically using, so maybe I'll back up. I think there's basically two ways you can build scenarios. You can create optimized scenarios of what's possible in the future. Look, if we do everything right, we can do this. This could be achieved. It's kind of an optimized vision. It's very aspirational. Alternatively, you can actually project past trends. What's happened in the past is very informative to what's likely going to happen in the future, right? So this is what's possible versus what's likely to happen in a business as usual scenario. Almost all the work exploring the achievement of the 17% protection target has been using this optimized approach. If we expand, if we get 600 million hectares of new parks and we're really thoughtful about where we put them to protect the biosphere, what could be achieved? In our work, we decided to take a different tact. Really, we're the only ones building scenarios projecting past trends in protected areas forward. So the starting point for that is, of course, to look to the past. What explains the distribution of protected areas that we already see in the landscape? Are they being located to maximize biodiversity benefits as those optimized scenarios suggest? Or are they being located to minimize conflict with competing land uses and to minimize cost? There's 170,000 protected areas out there, so it's a really good sample to look at the distribution of past protected areas. So we want to know, are those protected areas targeting biodiversity? So we developed some proxies for biodiversity. The first is we used 4,000 range maps for all the world's endangered vertebrates, particular birds, mammals, and amphibians. We just use those species because those are the ones we have mapped comprehensively. So that's, and we put them all together, and that's just showing you here, this is the species richness of threatened species. So our protected areas targeting places with lots of threatened species and therefore contributing biodiversity conservation. We developed a second proxy, which is the combined frequency that conservation templates identify each part as being important for conservation. Probably have no idea, it's a complicated sentence, but basically I showed you the map of biodiversity hotspots before. That's a template released by Conservation International, and they say that biodiversity hotspots are the most important places to conserve. That's Conservation International. There's the Wildlife Conservation Society, and they have another template called Last of the Wild. And they say these are the wild places, these are the places we need to conserve. There's other groups that have crisis ecoregions or high biodiversity wilderness areas. There's about 9 templates which identify, based on different criteria, where is important place to conserve. So we just gathered all that information, put it together, and we want to know, is protection focusing on places that are being mapped as important or as not important? As a proxy for protected area establishment cost, we used agricultural opportunity cost. So agriculture is the biggest driver of habitat loss. It's a major competing industry, which is competing for land with protected areas. So our protected areas simply trying to avoid these places which are valuable for agriculture. Kind of low cost approach to conservation. Sorry about this horrible slide. This is just symptomatic of me not having enough time to prepare for this talk. So you don't have to worry about the details here. Basically, this is the results of a general linear mix model looking to determine what explains the location of protected areas. Is it cost? Is it threatened vertebrates? Or is it conservation templates? Basically, the dominant effect is coming from cost. Protected areas are avoiding high-cost areas. They're very indifferent to biodiversity. They don't really care where biodiversity is distributed. And these analyses are done actually at the national level, so we're looking at national level protected area decisions. We're not looking at the global scale. So, you know, countries are the ones, Canada makes decisions about its parks. Is it locating its parks where there are no species and agriculture doesn't want to be, or is it locating its parks in the places that are best for biodiversity? So we're looking at national level decisions. Countries are locating parks to avoid high cost areas. The best way to illustrate that is to look at Australia. Again, this is a crappy figure. You don't have to look at what's on the top there. That's just another way of representing the information underlying this graph. So Australia is the birthplace of systematic conservation planning. It's the place where we should think most strategically about our protected areas. That's where the majority of the science about how to locate protected areas is coming from Australia. This is Australia's protected area network in grey. And in the background, those colors, that's agricultural opportunity costs. So reds are higher cost areas. You can see all of Australia's agriculturally suitable land are around the coasts. And that's also where all the people live. Around the coasts, that's where protected areas are small, and they're strategically located on mountaintops and in fertile tracts of land to avoid this agriculturally suitable land. If you look at central Australia, it's basically desert, very arid areas. That's where you get lots of parks. Parks are prolific and they're large. So this decision is being replicated 200 times for all countries around the world, basically. Okay, so what does this mean for achieving the 17% Aichi protection target? So that's what we explored. We want to know, okay, well, in the past, countries have avoided high-cost areas. What if they achieve this target, the 17% target, while avoiding high-cost areas as they have in the past? This is kind of business as usual. So to build these scenarios, we used the systematic conservation planning tool, Marxan. Doesn't really know, it's not really important the details of how it works, but it's a good tool to explore spatially explicit scenarios because it's target-based. So you give Marxan targets. So that target can be that every country protects 17% of its land, or a different specific target level for countries which have different levels. And you can ask Marxan to achieve those targets at the lowest cost, right? Simulating business as usual expansion. And we can also keep track of the conservation of threatened birds, mammals, and amphibians, right? So when we're building these scenarios for protected area expansion, we can ask, well, are species getting conserved from them? Okay, so we ran a few scenarios. I'm just going to show you some of our main results. This is a bit of a confusing graph, but it's an important one, so let's take a second to explain it to you. Each one of these dots is one of those 4,000 threatened birds, mammals, or amphibians. So a dot is a species. On the x-axis is the range size of the species. So some species have very big ranges and some have small ranges. And on the y-axis is the proportion of that species range which is covered by protected areas. The red line, that's a range-based conservation target. If the species is above the line, basically it has enough of its range within a protected area that we can consider it to be safe and unlikely to go extinct. This figure here is showing the current global protected area network. So this is basically a gap analysis. And what it's telling us is all these species above the line are currently protected. So 600 species out of 4,000 are currently protected by global protected areas. Okay, so that's a basic gap analysis. This graph is from simulating protected area expansion that focuses on low-cost areas to achieve the 17% global protected area network. So that's one scenario for protected area growth. What we can see is that some species come above the line and do become adequately protected, but very few, still only 850 species. So we undergo the biggest expansion of protected areas in history, and we still don't even get a quarter of species adequately protected. So that would be a real shame, right? We're really hopeful about this global protected area target, but it might not save all the species that we want to save. That's our first result. Some people might argue, well, Oscar, you're not being fair. Countries have agreed to distribute their protection equally across their major ecotypes. So Canada's not going to put all of its protected areas up in the tundra. It's going to put some in other ecotypes as well. So we explored that scenario here. Protection to achieve 17% target at low cost, but distributing across ecotypes, no difference, same take-home message. Species don't get conserved. You go, oh, Oscar, look, you're still not being fair. You know, at 2020, that's an interim target. After that, they're going to agree to more ambitious targets. And eventually, we're going to start to capture these species. So with this, we explored that. On the x-axis, this is protection from 17% all the way up to 30% of the globe protected in a way that minimizes cost, which is graphed with these red dots. You can see costs start to skyrocket as we protect more and more of the planet and becomes a bigger and bigger land use, whereas species conservation still only marginally increases. So I think I'm going to argue now that I've skinned that cat every way I possibly can, and the conclusion's pretty clear. Business as usual protected area expansion to reach the 17% target or even beyond doesn't protect the biosphere. It's just not going to happen. It hasn't in the past. Done the gap analysis, species aren't getting conserved. We've done the simulations going forward, species don't get conserved. And this is the reason. This map in red, that's showing the simulation, the priority areas from the simulation for low cost conservation. So in red, those are good places to protect for countries to meet their targets in the cheapest way possible. The green places, that's from an optimization which ensures that every threatened vertebrate gets above that red line. Every threatened vertebrate gets adequately protected. It's still only about 17% of the planet, which is pretty interesting that we could protect adequately every threatened vertebrate species and still stick within the 17% target. We're not talking about 30 or 40% of the globe. The yellow areas, that's where those places overlap. And the take-home year is very little overlap. Places that are cheap are not the places we need to go for species. A really dry mouth. Okay, so that's not really good news, right? Let's end on good news. So this is showing the efficiency frontier between what's possible for species conservation on the y-axis and the cost of that conservation on the x-axis, right? And we do this by running a whole bunch of simulations all the way from asking Marxan to not care about biodiversity and just minimize cost. And that's this scenario here. It's really cheap. It's about $5 billion in lost agricultural opportunities, but very few species get protected. And then we start changing the simulation. We say, well, Marxan, start to care about species a little bit. How about you meet the targets, but give us a few species? And then we start to move up these different scenarios all the way to that scenario where we make sure that every single species is adequately protected. What's important to note here is how steep this graph is early on. So it's possible for just a little bit of extra cost, if countries are strategic and they value biodiversity, it's possible to get a lot more species conserved for very little additional cost. So there are options to conserve species. So just to conclude, it's possible to achieve the 17% protection target, but if it's done in a business as usual way, it's really not going to capture species. It's not going to get those species conserved, right? So that second target, Aichi target 12, to prevent the extinction of all known threatened species, that's not going to happen from protected areas in a business as usual way. But based on that efficiency frontier I showed you, it's possible to get a lot more biodiversity benefits out of protected area expansion if we're strategic. But we need those international targets under the Convention on Biodiversity. We need them to explicitly recognize the value of biodiversity. So at the moment, myself and the collaborator James Watson and our postdoc Moreno, we're putting together a special issue for conservation letters that builds on this. So there's about 12 papers we're putting in, which is kind of outlining the science needs to get to better targets for the next round of the commitments under the CBD. And we have some great people contributing. We have the chief scientist for IUCN, the chief scientist for the World Conservation Monitoring Center, and the chief scientist for BirdLife International, all leading papers going into the special issue. And we have a sponsored seminar or workshop at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii next year, where they're going to start to discuss the next round of targets for the CBD. So we're going to launch the special issue there at that Congress. This work is very collaborative. It's very interdisciplinary, brings in a lot of people with different strengths. These are some of the people. James, which I mentioned, he's actually going to be up here next month to give one of the colloquiums, I think later at the end of the month. And Moreno, our postdoc, is also coming up for a couple of weeks in February to do some work. So you'll meet some of these people next month. Okay, well, thank you for your time. I think I'm basically within what was allotted to me, so thanks for listening.
Thanks very much. Any questions? Oh, Michelle.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, I missed where the 17% number came from, because it can't be scientifically derived, can it? Because I've heard 50% is more like...
Yeah, so there's a big push, half for nature.
Yeah.
That's the 50%. So that's, I don't know which groups are really pushing to have 50% be the protection target. But yeah, there's really, even those adequacy targets that I showed for species conservation, where am I here? I'm calling a species adequately protected if more than a certain proportion of its range is protected. There's not really any good science underlying that. That's just our best kind of rule of thumb that we currently have at a species range conservation level. But at a global level, how much land do we need to see in protected areas? I mean, there's really no idea about how much we need to see. So 50% would be great, but the 17% is basically what was agreed to politically, what countries felt that they could achieve by 2020. I'm guessing it's not really scientifically based. So it's actually target 11. They've agreed to protect 10% of the oceans, 10% of marine areas, and 17% of terrestrial and inland waterways.
Okay, thank you. And my other question was, can you explain that histogram? You said it was the Kuznets curve.
Sure, yeah.
What is it showing, really?
Yeah, I probably should have taken it out, but let's get into it. Wait, where do I need to be? I need to be way up here. Okay, so I'm grouping countries by their level of economic development as defined by the World Bank. I'm grouping them as low income, low middle income, upper middle income, and high income countries based on their GDP per capita. And I'm asking, over the last 2 decades, how has the human footprint changed on average for countries that group into those different areas? So low income countries, these are really the poorest countries on the planet. Their human footprint hasn't expanded dramatically. Countries that have a little bit more wealth and potentially more capacity to start to tap into their natural resources, but it's still probably going to be heavily natural resource dependent because they're early stages of development. These are the countries that indeed we're seeing very big increases in the human footprint. When you compare that to wealthy countries, which potentially are no longer as resource dependent, or they can better mitigate the expansion of the human footprint.
Or we just outsource our impacts.
That's
to
a
those
great question.
people.
Yeah, that's great. That's why, because that's the first question that jumps to mind. Shout it out. Okay, so do we just outsource? So wealthy countries like Canada, especially the wealthiest countries like Canada, we're actually seeing a contraction of the human footprint. So are we simply exporting our demands for raw materials to other countries, like those lower middle income countries, and we're having actually simply over what we could call over the horizon consumption, where our demands are met through expanding human footprints in other countries. I think, yes, okay, this shows us starting to dive into that question. So what we did is we took the countries that their economies grew the most over the last 2 decades. So these are countries that have done well economically. And we've asked, how have their human footprint changed? So in some countries, the human footprint has decreased. So they've grown economically, yet the footprint has declined. So that's kind of like a good news story. Okay, we can have our cake and eat it too. In other countries, while they grew economically, their footprint grew dramatically. Countries that did bad environmentally, they're actually net importers of forestry products and agricultural products. So those are really big industries and ones we could get data on. Countries that did well environmentally over the last 2 decades while their economies grew, they were actually exporters overall of forestry products and agricultural products. So this is not a complete measure of whether countries are simply exporting their demands. Like we don't consider carbon pollution, mining, manufacturing. But there's reason to believe it's not simply over the horizon consumption, and the exporting of our impacts.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just have a quick question about the your updated human footprint map. You have 9 different categories here: urban, night lights, cropland, pasture, population density. I noticed that forestry, industrial forestry, is not in there.
Yeah.
That's interesting, and also I imagine that would very much change your map. Is there a particular reason why industrial forestry doesn't belong in a map of a human footprint?
There's absolutely no reason why it doesn't belong there. There's a reason it's not there, and that's data availability. So basically, we gather data on things that we thought were important, but also pragmatically on things that we could acquire or create data on. Forestry is conspicuously missing, and mining is conspicuously missing because there's no globally consistent information on where those two industries are distributed. That's particularly relevant for Canada. So I'm thinking that once we start to explore some of these ideas in Canada, really contrasting kind of a global product that ignores really important industries in Canada will be quite interesting. Because in Canada, we can probably get much better information on the distribution of forestry and the distribution of mining. And it should change the map quite a lot.
Yeah, to do that footprint mapping, do you need heavy-duty computing, or is it essentially desktop plus
It's
a
not
little?
too bad. Yeah, the footprint's not too bad. That's the global scenario building. That was actually pretty insane. So we used supercomputers for that. It would have been, I think, 14 years of analyses if we did it on a good desktop. And the thing is, we're using 4,000 species range maps. And again, I'm having a really tough time in review lately. Reviewers kept on saying, we know those range maps are wrong. Half the time, the species are not where we think they are. So there are really a lot of commission errors where we falsely think they're species in places that they really aren't. So what we did is we actually created 400,000 simulated range maps for those species where we simulated commission errors across their distribution. And then to build that efficiency frontier, that's, I think, 600 runs of 1 billion search iterations each. So we created all these randomly distributed perturbed range maps, and then we built that scenario, that efficiency frontier. So that was a big analysis. But the footprint's really not too bad because we're not. It's really once you come in, you have to simulate things over and over again that it becomes arduous. We've been doing a lot of work with this forest cover data set, actually. This Matt Hansen, the University of Maryland forest cover data set, and that's terabytes of data in one map, and that's pretty tough to work with.
You mentioned marine protected areas briefly, and I was wondering if they are also located in the least cost areas rather than the areas that may protect the most biodiversity.
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't. There have been 2 other analyses looking at terrestrial protected areas in addition to what we've just done, but they hadn't really used real proxies for the distribution of biodiversity. So they were really asking, are protected areas cost diverse? They weren't also asking, are they targeting biodiversity? Because it's possible to do both if you're smart about it. You can avoid high cost areas, but still be attracted to biodiversity valuable areas. So we were kind of asking that question in combination. So we're the first study to do that, but. Yeah, I don't think there's been any analysis in the marine environment to look at. There has been gap analyses now. One just came out last year. How well do protected areas cover species distributed in the oceans? But really, no one's looked at. Are we being smarter now with marine protected areas or not? Yeah.
I've used a similar map with condition of watersheds around the world by Voris Mahdi out of the City University. Are you familiar with his work at all?
For watersheds, there's a group at McGill that created.
Yeah, he created one back in. It was a globe. It was similar to this in a sense, and it was on across the globe, basic conditions of different watersheds around the world. And but he did it in 2010, and I was wondering if you knew about it and if there's been an update at all since then.
We partnered with, I think, somebody involved with that analysis.
Yeah.
I don't do a lot of freshwater stuff, so I don't really know the details, but I know that I think it must be the same data set. I think it was led by a team at McGill. But yeah, it was looking at the watershed level, looking at cumulative human pressures or human change. We haven't used it for any of our stuff, and I don't really know the details of the data set. There's also a marine one, says Ben Halpern in California has created a marine human footprint, which we have a student now just starting to work with Ben to look at the interface between the terrestrial footprint that we've created and his marine product, and look at places where the terrestrial because a lot of terrestrial impacts actually run off into the ocean and create these marine dead zones. So we want to look for places where we're maybe managing terrestrial impacts fairly well, such that they don't leach over into the marine environment.
Hi, I had a question. I was just wondering how much tourism impacted the protection of areas and how seeking that high biodiversity helped protect that. Have you considered that at all?
I haven't considered. I think that's a great question when you're looking at tourism, especially for the wildest places. Where ecotourism, is most viable, right? It's places where you still have large, kind of natural areas where we can enjoy nature. We didn't consider that impact. Again, we're kind of, when we're thinking global scale, when we're thinking big picture, we're constrained usually by the availability of data. So asking questions about ecotourism, that's really probably currently it's a finer scale question. If you look within a catchment, or we look within a particular protected area, what are the impacts we're seeing from ecotourism? Towards ecotourism, or towards investigating their impacts? Yes, yeah, because that's, the idea behind ecotourism is it gives value to natural areas. People come into them and they pay to be there. So it's definitely a potential mechanism to fund, the maintenance of these natural areas. But at the same time, then potentially they're degrading them.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question on your map in man footprint. Do you think it will shift, or it is shifting with time? Like one particular region may get large footprint right now, but after 50 years that region may not get, and the other part may get the higher footprints?
Why am I having trouble finding our here? So we haven't made any projections going forward, and that's, which I think is what you're getting at. What's it going to look like in the future?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we haven't explored that yet at all. But that's somewhere that we do want to go. How do we start to explain likely trajectories for the footprint going forward? We know that things are changing because of many lines of evidence. We know that it's changing because of analyses we've done within the Human Footprint Project. This is showing change over the last 2 decades. There's a lot of change in some places. Some of that change, expanding footprint, other parts, contracting footprint. As part of the wilderness analysis, we're also seeing lots of change over the last 2 decades. Something that we want to do is these places which were wilderness back in 1993, but are no longer wilderness today. What explains the location of those places where wilderness has succumbed to the human footprint? How does this place differ from this place, which is still wilderness? And then we can use that information to project forward. Which are places that are still wilderness today that share similar characteristics to places that recently succumbed to the human footprint? So what we want to do is we want to create a risk map for current wilderness areas. Which of those are most likely to change going forward? And that could be important information for targeting conservation efforts if we want to maintain that wilderness.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Oh. Did I see a hand? No? No. Okay. Thank you very much, Oscar. I want to thank him for his, again, stepping in on short notice, and really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure, and thanks you guys.